Okay, and then I will share my screen and all right, so I hope everyone can see this. Like Maria said, we are talking about, we've been working with Just Deeds, but we're talking about the disparate impacts of racially restrictive covenants. We are a group of students from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, and we'll just introduce ourselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Marin. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin.
Hi everyone, my name is Seda. I am from Yerevan, Armenia, and I use she, hers pronouns.
Hi, my name is Maggie Bonson. I'm from St. Louis Park, Minnesota, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, my name is Linnea. I'm from Boulder, Colorado, and I use she, her pronouns as well.
Hi, I'm Miles. I'm from Chicago, Illinois, and I use he, him pronouns.
Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm from Golden Valley, Minnesota, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
Hi everyone, my name's Imani. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm from St. Cloud, Minnesota.
Hi everyone, my name's Sam Primizic. I'm from Boulder, Colorado, and I also use he, his pronouns.
I'm Christina. I'm from Roseville, Minnesota, and I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Emma Ziegler, and I'm from Grays Lake, Illinois, and I use she, her pronouns. And as was mentioned before, we're all a group of senior political science majors at St. Olaf College, and we're all currently enrolled in the class Courageous Resistance, which is about resistance against unjust systems. And as a part of our class, we have an academic civic engagement portion, which we're using as an opportunity to work with Just Deeds through our research skills, providing educational materials for this presentation today, and also to use in their website. But this is more than just a project. We are all really excited to be here and to be able to speak with you all today. So it is more than just a class project for us. And throughout this presentation, we're going to be talking about some of the modern implications and impacts of racial covenants and redlining. So we should define those terms so we know what those mean. Racial covenants are lines of text included in warranty deeds, which prohibit the sale of land to people of color and were used by real estate developers as a tool of segregation. And redlining was a similar practice where banks would refuse to give loans in certain geographic areas, often inner city neighborhoods, as a discriminatory practice against people of color. And I have on the screen there a map of some redlined neighborhoods and communities in Minneapolis. And those like red, you can't really see the legend, but the different colors of those neighborhoods and communities would determine how likely the bank was to lend out loans to those communities. And the red areas were areas where you could receive no loans. And that meant that those communities, which were predominantly people of color, were unable to accumulate wealth and really improve their status. The first topic that we're going to cover in depth today is the environment and environmental racism and how those racist practices affect in the response of the environment today. So what is environmental racism and likewise environmental justice? Environmental racism is defined as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages individuals, groups, or communities based on race. And environmental racism really develops as a concept in 1982 with the Warren County landfill protests, which I have an image of up on the screen. And Warren County, North Carolina is a predominantly Black community in North Carolina where a hazardous waste dump was being developed. And in response, the community really didn't want this and loudly protested, which prompted an EPA investigation throughout North Carolina and the South, which found that most hazardous waste sites were located in predominantly Black communities. And this protest eventually led to the publishing of the 1987 Toxic Waste and Race Report, which found that throughout the whole of the United States, environmental dumps were far more likely to be located in Black communities across the United States. And this report was very robust and was the first of its kind and influenced a large push for environmentally just legislation, which ultimately accumulated in 1994 with the Bush administration passing an executive order creating offices of environmental justice in both the EPA and the DOJ. And in response to this idea of environmental racism is the concept of environmental justice. And I really like the city of Minneapolis' definition, which says that environmental justice emphasizes accountability, democratic practices, remedying the historical impact of environmental racism, just and equitable treatment, and self-determination. So now about pollution specifically in Minnesota. In 2019, the Minnesota Department of Health and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency jointly released a report titled Life and Breath, which used data from 2013, which is the most recent available, and it found that about 5 to 10% of all residents who died and 1 to 5% of all residents who visited the hospital or emergency room did so partly because of pollution. And this pollution was specifically particulate matter and ground level ozone, which we commonly associate with smog. This is a really striking fact because it means that roughly 2,000 to 4,000 deaths, 500 additional hospital stays, and 800 emergency room visits were avoidable and specifically caused by smog and pollution in Minnesota. The report also found that rates of asthma and respiratory illness was far higher among disadvantaged groups, and that pollution varies in areas based on the proportion of the population with health insurance, poverty levels, proximity to major highways, and whether or not the area is urban or rural. And you can see with those characteristics, which I just listed out and which are on the screen, there's a lot of overlap between those ideas and your racial identity. A person of color is more likely to live in an urban area, as we're going to touch upon a lot more later in this presentation. Is more likely to live close to major highways and also is more likely to be impoverished. And therefore, you can see a lot of overlap between what causes you to be affected disproportionately by pollution and also your racial identity.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go off a bit on what Emma said. So one of the most prominent ways that environmental racism manifests itself is through community health. So a person's zip code is said to be the single best indicator of their life expectancy. And this is because the neighborhood that a person lives in determines the amount of exposure they have to air pollution and toxins in their environment. It determines how much green space they live near, which has a lot of health benefits or consequences if they aren't getting enough. It determines how accessible nutritious food is and how readily available medical care is, and even the quality of that medical care. So if you look at this map of the Twin Cities, the different shades of blue represent different life expectancies based on district. So the lighter shades are longer life expectancies and the darker are shorter. So overall, the Twin Cities have pretty high life expectancies, but if you look at the more central cities, you'll see that the life expectancies are less than 75 years, which is almost a 10-year difference from the surrounding area. So even just a difference of a few miles can determine whether a person's life expectancy is less than 75 years or greater than 83 years in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So one telling example of zip codes determining life expectancy is in North Minneapolis, right along the banks of the Mississippi River. There's a hazardous recycling plant called Northern Metals that has been falsely reporting its emissions measurement so that it aligned with Minnesota's environmental codes, knowing that their emissions rate were unsafe for the community. And even though Northern Metals was sued and shut down last fall, the surrounding area, the 55411 zip code, still has the highest rate of asthma hospitalizations in Minnesota, with 5 times the state's average. And the fact that 49% of residents in the zip code are Black and only 16% are white makes this a very textbook example of environmental racism. So I also wanted to include just a few statistics about the impacts of environmental racism on the health of BIPOC communities in Minnesota, because I think it's really helpful to have some concrete figures just to understand the magnitude of this issue. So the first is that Black Minnesotans under the age of 65 are 6 times more likely to die from asthma than white Minnesotans, which makes sense if you think of the placement of environmental hazards throughout the state. The next is that infant mortality rates for Native Americans in Minnesota is 3 times higher than it is for white Minnesotans. The cancer risk for Black Minnesotans is 2.25 times higher than it is for white Minnesotans. And the last one I included is that Latinx Minnesotans are testing positive for COVID at more than 4 times the rest of Minnesotans' population and about 9 times more than the white population of Minnesota. So all of these risks can really be tied back in a lot of ways to the environment that someone lives in and the resources that they have access to in their community.
I thought we would briefly touch upon what other communities are doing about environmental racism, environmental justice. Minneapolis specifically, in their large comprehensive city plan until 2040, has Policy 61, which is titled Environmental Justice in Green Zones. And this policy acknowledges that BIPOC people are disproportionately affected by pollution and environmental hazards, which I listed out on the screen. And the purpose of the policy is to utilize resources in disadvantaged areas to accommodate and solve the injustice of environmental racism. Huntington Park is a suburb of LA with a large Hispanic population, which is similar to Golden Valley in the sense that both are suburbs of a larger urban area. And Huntington Park includes environmental justice in their city plan, and they specifically aim to improve brownfields, and they have a lead paint abatement program for low-income people because lead paint is an indoor environmental hazard and toxin. And Eugene Springfield, Oregon likewise includes environmental justice in their city plan, and they specifically aim to reduce emissions, advance energy efficiency, and strengthen community resilience.
So to bring this back to redlining and racial covenants, I have some data about the environmental impacts of redlining. So according to a study published in the New York Times, neighborhoods that were redlined are on average 5 degrees warmer during the summer than neighborhoods that were never redlined. And this difference is really critical because during heat waves, every 1 degree increase in temperature increases the risk of death by 2.5%. And on top of that, neighborhoods that have been redlined have significantly higher amounts of paved surfaces and nearby highways, which are proven to worsen community health. And this again comes back to the amount of accessible green space because there are fewer trees to cool temperatures and absorb pollution, and less green space also contributes to worse mental health and again, higher rates of disease. So even though racial covenants have been illegal for decades, their impact lives on in very serious ways. And the segregation that has resulted from redlining and racial covenants has created neighborhoods that are just miles apart with almost a 10-year difference in life expectancies. So this is just one reason why the work that Just Deeds is doing is so important. And they're really helping the Golden Valley community acknowledge the issues of historic segregation from racial covenants, which then allows us to create informed responses to environmental racism that prioritize the most vulnerable in these communities.
So we're going to be shifting over to transportation now, another aspect of how restrictive covenants are really intersectional with other aspects of daily life. So I'd like to remind everyone of the story of Rondo neighborhood. So about 1910 to 1950, Rondo neighborhood was a hub for BIPOC communities, activism. They had thriving jobs and infrastructure. In between those years, they embraced the railroad industry and also housed many new BIPOC-owned small businesses. Yeah, all the way back in the 1930s, city planners began discussion of building a highway for commuters coming to and from the Twin Cities into surrounding areas. And then about 20 years later, the Federal Highway Act of 1956 was passed, which promised funding to lay a highway down, which ended up splitting Rondo neighborhood in half with the construction of I-94. So here's a map of I-94. It's the yellow-orange line. The blue square surrounding Rondo neighborhood will show you that it splits the neighborhood in half.
I'm so sorry.
So there was immediate resistance. Rondo neighborhood, sorry about the noise. Rondo neighborhood and the St. Anthony Improvement Association had immediate fallback, but to no avail because Black homeowners were forcibly removed from the properties replaced by the highway. They were unable to build in property value due to noise and noise pollution as well as high traffic areas. Neighborhood wealth and improvement was immediately halted by the will of the white city planners. This also destabilized very rich and diverse community, displaced community activism, and the interstate construction drastically impacted economic prosperity in the surrounding neighborhoods, which were mostly occupied by BIPOC communities. So I'd like to talk about the intersectionality of transportation and housing. So according to U.S. Census data report, 62% of all persons of color in greater Minnesota live in urban areas like Emma mentioned before, including surrounding suburbs. Metropolitan Council performed a study proving that residents within areas of more concentrated poverty rely more heavily on public transit, biking, and walking. The interstate development disrupts these modes of transit, and they don't utilize the modes of, or the interstate that ended up splitting their neighborhoods and limiting their property wealth growth. So they also found that lower household income led to higher reliability of public transit, as well as less reliability on automobiles and interstates. So going back to restrictive covenants, this created segregated neighborhoods historically, which prevented BIPOC communities to grow in property wealth because of interstate intervention, leaving their communities less economically prosperous with significantly less use of the interstate that divides their community. So interstates are just one aspect in which restrictive covenants prevented BIPOC communities to change locations and force them to live in neighborhoods that were unable to build in property, wealth, and income. Here's a map. So the lighter green areas are areas of concentrated poverty, and the dark green areas are more broad concentrated poverty. And you can kind of see how interstate intersections are crossing through a lot of these areas of concentrated poverty.
So building off of what Linnea was saying, I'm going to talk about current transit data, our current transportation systems in Golden Valley, as well as the future of transportation in Golden Valley and the greater Minnesota. So automobile dependency is defined as high levels of per capita automobile travel, automobile-oriented land use patterns, and reduced transport alternatives. So the opposite of automobile dependency is a balanced transportation system with more mixed travel patterns. So looking at Golden Valley, about 80% of Golden Valley residents drove alone to work, meaning that Golden Valley is very automobile dependent, with just 3% of residents using public transportation to get to work. Looking at this in comparison with the Metro Transit facts of Minnesota, we can see some huge differences. So 44% of transit customers are people of color. When we look at Golden Valley, the population is about 85.8% white. So there's a huge difference there. 47% of transit customers have no working automobile available. So for many Golden Valley residents, public transportation is just another option, but for so many transit customers, it's their only option. So it makes Golden Valley very inaccessible and maybe an obstacle for these people to move into Golden Valley. And one last thing I wanted to highlight was that 43% of transit customers have an annual household income of below $25,000. When we look at this in comparison with Golden Valley, there's a huge difference with the median household income of $93,000. So the northwestern suburbs has done some things to try to remedy these issues of transportation discrimination and accessibility. So the Blue Line Extension Project was intended to go through downtown Minneapolis, through North Minneapolis, Golden Valley, Robbinsdale, Crystal, Brooklyn Park. But unfortunately, even though this plan has been in the works for more than a decade, the rail company has had some issues and there has been an unsuccessful negotiation. So while this project had a lot of good intentions of serving these diverse areas of the metro and increasing the opportunities for communities that are dependent on public transportation, right now it does not look like the Blue Line extension will be moving forward. And so when we look at the transit system in Golden Valley, and this is taken from the 2040 Comprehensive Plan, the plan relies heavily on the Blue Line Extension Project. So we can see here this light blue line. This is the Blue Line Extension. It really only was intended to go through a small portion of Golden Valley. But if we look at here, we can see the Blue Line Transit Station is here right next to a park and ride lot. And surrounding it is Theodore Wirth Park, as well as an area filled with racial covenants. So looking forward to creating sustainable transportation systems, it's so important to look at the history of these communities and these neighborhoods, because racial covenants, are still embedded in Golden Valley. So it's just so important to look at how these things can impact different aspects of our community. So looking forward and planning and investing in our future. So Golden Valley, in their 2030 and 2040 comprehensive plans, they already have two amazing goals that are about preserving and enhancing the transportation system and improving the functionality and safety of the transportation system. So these goals are already laid out. It's just about implementing a balanced transportation system that relies on high quality transportation. And so this can really lead to really great things. We've talked about a lot of things with environmental justice. So this can reduce energy consumption, pollution emission, improve public health, and bring down consumer costs and parking costs. So there's a lot of great things that can come out of investing in a good transportation system. And so like racial covenants, there still is an impact of transport discrimination in Golden Valley, but there are opportunities to find sustainable and equitable solutions that address these injustices.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the impacts of restrictive covenants on access to affordable and nutritious foods. I'm going to start by looking at the broader trends that can be seen nationwide and then conclude by addressing the food deserts in Golden Valley specifically. So, restrictive covenants, like we've all talked about, have left a legacy of redlining and racial segregation, resulting in neighborhood economic decline. Neighborhood economic decline being any negative development in the physical, social, or economic conditions of a neighborhood as experienced by its residents. This often combines a number of negative developments, such as declining physical quality of the actual housing and the housing stock, the outflow of more affluent households, and the inflow of less affluent households. This leads to a lack of basic services like healthcare, banking, fewer jobs, means of transportation, lack of access to means of transportation, and notably for this presentation, limited access to nutritious food to put on the table. So I will, of course, be focusing on this lack of access to nutritious food, otherwise known as food deserts. It's no coincidence that low-income neighborhoods and communities of color are often missing affordable and nutritious food options, but have easy access to fast foods and convenience stores. So food deserts are really a manifestation of structural inequities like restrictive covenants that have been solidified over time. But what exactly is a food desert? As you can see on this slide, or I think it's the next one. Yep. Food deserts are areas where people have limited access to a variety of healthy and affordable foods. That's an updated definition from 2012 from the USDA as well, sorry. So these regions of the country often feature large proportions of households with low incomes, inadequate access to transportation, and a limited number of retailers that provide healthy and affordable foods. According to a very prominent study that was conducted by the United States Department of Agriculture, about 23.5 million people live in these low-income food desert areas. At the time, that was roughly 8.4% of the US population, which is massive. And on top of that, of all households, 2.3 million people live more than a mile from a supermarket and don't have access to a vehicle. So, food deserts are caused and perpetuated by a number of factors. Transportation, which has already been touched on, is a huge one. Mostly that proximity doesn't always correlate with accessibility. Vehicle availability and the use of public transportation are critical factors to accessing healthy and affordable foods. If an affordable grocery store is a mile or 2 miles away, that's still an immense distance for somebody to walk carrying groceries. Two other big ones are urban density and income that often go hand in hand, where areas with higher levels of poverty are much more likely to be food deserts regardless of their rural or urban designation. Furthermore, lower income drastically increases the risk of hunger, which can target any race, but disproportionately affects the BIPOC community. Most low-income or impoverished areas are a product of redlining, and redlining is only a symptom of the historic restrictive covenants that create these low-income minority communities, ultimately leading to a lack of resources, little to no community funding, and drastic health disparities. So, on the same lines, areas with limited access to healthy and affordable food often lack access to other services as well. If you want to go back one slide. There it is. Like banks, healthcare, transportation infrastructure, and even parks or recreational areas. So in addition to having poor access, residents of impoverished or deprived areas frequently face higher prices for food and other necessities, which just furthers this cycle of food deserts. Furthermore, poor education and limited health care services in conjunction with these high prices for fresh foods may result in a poor diet and adverse health outcomes for residents of these areas that are already lacking sufficient healthcare infrastructure. So historically and still today, these communities are plagued with low income, low education levels, and high unemployment, which makes them unattractive markets for supermarkets and grocery stores, further perpetuating this cycle of food deserts. But even if chain or fancy stores were to build in these low income areas, unless the neighborhoods received more economic and community support, it would just lead to mass gentrification. Which is why the research that this group has done and that Just Deeds is doing is so important to eliminating the historic structures that continue to exploit and oppress the BIPOC communities. Okay, now we can go to the next one. So what does this look like in Golden Valley? So a story map created by ArcGIS, which is one of the leading mapping software companies today, will help us visualize this connection between race, income, and food deserts in Minnesota. So I've just taken a snapshot of the Golden Valley area, and right now we're looking at the relationship between income and food deserts. You can see on the legend how they break down income and what the different colors correlate to. And so what we're really looking at is access to healthy food is determined by both price and distance barriers. Here we can examine the relationship between proximity to a grocery store as measured by a short walkable distance of 1/4 mile. So that's going to be those blue circles, and low income neighborhoods shown here, where residents are less likely to be able to purchase healthy foods. So those blue circles are areas where there is not a grocery store that they have determined as healthy and affordable within a 1/4 mile distance. Then we can go on to the next one, which will look at how diversity relates to food deserts. So here, our GIS defines diversity as the likelihood that two persons chosen at random from the same area belong to different race or ethnic groups. And so you can see the diversity index as indicated in the legend and the same 1/4 mile buffer with the circles. So our main takeaway from this is that restrictive covenants have left a legacy of concentrated poverty that disproportionately impacts minority communities, highlighting that lower income and marginalized identities are critical factors in determining low access to healthy and affordable foods. If you are at all interested in looking at the larger map and the larger Minnesota Twin Cities area, we will share a link at the end of this presentation. That's all I have.
Thank you, Imani. Now we'll switch gears and talk about housing discrimination in general. I should start saying that the legacy of nearly a century old of institutional practices has embedded racial and ethnic ghettos deep in American urban demography. Specifically, the practices of mortgage lenders and property insurers may have done more to shape housing patterns than bold racism ever did. By concentrating public housing in central city locations and financing highways to facilitate suburban development, the federal government has further reinforced emerging dual housing markets. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I'd really like to start with just explaining what housing discrimination is and what forms it can take. The first fact is that recent research using data from Home Mortgage Disclosure Act has found that Black mortgage loan applicants are denied twice as often as whites. I'll let that sink in. Based on 2019 results, the white home ownership rate is 74%, while only 44% of African Americans own homes in the United States, and the typical white family has 10 times the wealth of the typical Black family. The real estate industry, from builders to real estate agents to bankers, is set up largely to propagate the status quo, and that has certainly been the resulting effect. seriously systematic problems exist, and as a result, the disparities in ownership and wealth creation persist. So I would like to also bring a couple of examples to explain what those forms of racist acts can take. For example, although the real estate industry cannot outwardly discriminate on the basis of race, if you're a builder, let's say, you can certainly build houses only in white neighborhoods or with floor plans and amenities that strictly cater to that clientele. Second, if you're, let's say, an agent, you can show folks houses only in racially concentrated or largely white areas, depending on who your client is. And then third, let's say if you're a banker, you can turn down loans to households of color at a higher rate, which has proven to be the case. My next slide, I will be talking about an interesting study that has done a quasi-experimental study on to detecting discrimination based on race within housing. I would like to say, like, the way they have done it, just for you to understand the mechanism behind. The audit is usually conducted using pairs of racially dissimilar testers who have been matched to be similar on all characteristics that influence the outcome except race. So the tester pairs are then sent into one or more situations in which discrimination is suspected. For instance, testers may be sent to rent or buy an apartment, and after the outcomes of many audits are observed, the racial difference in the results provides a measure of discrimination. And my next slide, please. This is an overwhelming table, so I don't want you to get lost in it. I just wanted to show it and just say what it illustrates. It's overall measures from the audit of the presence of favorable treatment in these categories that favor the white or minority auditor. You can see the third and the fourth columns. The difference or ratio between the audit pairs in which the white auditor was favored minus the audit pairs in which the minority auditor was favored provides a measure of the discrimination-based advantage that whites enjoy in housing searches in each category. This was a lot of information, but next, I think most importantly, are the major findings of the study that are in my next slide. So one major finding is the continuing significant housing market discrimination against Blacks and Hispanics. Discrimination against Blacks is especially strong in the sales market, while Hispanics are subject to higher levels of discrimination in the rental market. While auditors are also favored over white auditors are also favored over Asian auditors, but only in the sales market. And similarly, smaller audit studies have also found that the evidence of discrimination in the initial over-the-phone call contact to rent apartments against Hispanic and Black identifiable colors. The second finding was a little bit of good news, is that the housing discrimination audits is that the incidence of discrimination against Blacks and Hispanics has declined significantly since 1989. However, the exception is the racial steering in sales for Blacks has increased in prevalence since 1989. It's important for us to zoom back from what I and my friends were saying and link this back again to the conversation about racial covenants and how they have paved the way for deeply rooted housing discrimination. A lot of the issues that I talked about are very implicit and not easy to identify. Therefore, it is important to look back at the history and train our minds to be racially conscious, as well as correct our mistakes of the past and the present. And with that, I'll pass the mic on to Miles to talk about the affordability of housing.
Yeah, I'm going to finish this section talking about affordable housing, which I think is an important key towards creating a more equitable future. The Department of Housing and Urban Development defines affordable housing as a dwelling that a household can obtain for 30% or less of its income, depending on the where in the country you are and the sort of economic situation. This does not necessarily represent what the poorest people in any given place can afford. The lack of affordable housing can perpetuate many social problems, which I'll talk about a little, one of which is job opportunities. Many places in the country with the best job opportunities don't always, sometimes lack a housing stock that can support people who come from low income backgrounds or don't have housing secure or financial security that can sort of allow them to take advantage of those job opportunities, which can lead to a sort of further entrenchment of income inequality and sort of a lack of economic mobility. Another important place we can see the necessity of affordable housing being is during this pandemic. Many of us have spent the last year or so in our home, either working or trying to avoid spreading the COVID-19 pandemic. But if a large chunk of our population lacks housing security, that puts the overall population at risk for exposure to COVID-19. This is not just in reference to homeless people. This can also refer to people who may lack proper sanitation, live in overcrowded conditions, or if there's many people coming in and out of their living situation, it is just puts them more at risk and more likely to be exposed to the virus, which puts sort of the communities and our country as a whole at a greater risk. And then lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about income diversity. That a lack of affordable housing and a lack of affordable housing plan can often, if there isn't a plan to create affordable housing in these areas, in wealthier areas of towns or cities, that can lead to income segregation, which in turn often is followed by racial or ethnic segregation, which can lead to a sort of entrenchment of prejudice or misunderstanding between the two groups because they're not interacting with each other just sort of out on the street and in their neighborhoods. And lower income residents of these areas can lose the benefits of pooling tax resources that go to important public goods like schooling, which Sam will now talk about.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so transitioning from what Miles was saying about affordable housing and just also echoing what others have been saying about how your zip code really does determine or at least has a very large effect on your general well-being or just livelihood in general. So I'm going to be giving sort of a brief, or I guess I should say more general overview of how quality of education for an individual is largely affected by their place of residence, or their place of residence, or just the neighborhood they grow up in. And then I'm going to hand it off to Maggie, who's going to take over with explaining how this comes to fruition in what's called the achievement gap. So when it comes to public schooling, the amount of resources that any particular school really receives is predominantly, if not completely, based on property taxes, based on the neighborhoods that's surrounding it. So if a school is located in a poorer area with lower property taxes, the money it receives will be a lot less than its wealthier counterparts. So this money can go from anywhere from anything from textbooks to faculty salaries. It really depends, and these resources are really important, obviously. So again, the obvious problem here with allocating money to schools in this way comes from the fact that kids coming from families with lower incomes have access to less resources than those of their wealthier counterparts. And obviously this translates to the quality of education as well. So kids coming from families with lower incomes are getting access to lower quality of education than their wealthier counterparts. And this really ends up sort of hindering students' ability to have an upward mobility and keeps them kind of locked, or can keep them locked in their socioeconomic class, just based on where they grew up. Kristen, you can go to the next slide. So just transitioning into how this is sort of getting, I guess, exacerbated in today's world with just people having more access to internet and just resources there. There's a lot of new websites out there where you can see school ratings, and what goes into these ratings is anything from demographic makeup of schools to just general student performance. So how well they're doing year to year, whether they're prepared for the curriculum with each year going forward, and then specifically for high school, a lot of the rating comes from like whether these students are prepared to go on to college. So this transparency is great. I mean, it's families and parents absolutely deserve to have be able to make a well-informed decision about where their kid is going to go to school. That's totally understandable. I guess the downside here though is that, I mean, once parents can see sort of school ratings with schools around them or schools in sort of adjacent districts, I mean, this obviously this makes it so like parents will want to move possibly to areas where their child will be guaranteed a spot at a higher rated school, understandably so. But what this causes, and Amani talked about this with sort of this draining of affluence with food deserts, and this is definitely applicable here. When these families move to a different area with higher rated schools, and this trend keeps on happening, the property taxes in that original area are going to decrease, which is going to actually take funding away from schools in those areas, which chances are were already lower than the sort of the wealthier areas. So this creates this very vicious cycle, and it snowballs. It's cyclical, as I mentioned on the first slide. And again, this cycle really does hinder young people's sort of ability to have this social or this upward mobility, and can be really detrimental to everything in regards to that. So then circling back towards this, Maggie's going to talk about sort of the achievement gap and why this is coming of fruition of sort of this lack of access to quality of education.
Hi there, my name is Maggie. Like Sam was saying and other people before us, suburban neighborhoods were purposely built for white people, and because of this reason, these families had better access to education. This is also similar for middle to upper class families having more flexibility and control over where their kids go to school. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the achievement gap. It is also sometimes called the opportunity gap. And one way to see the impact of racially restrictive covenants is looking at the achievement and opportunity gaps in different communities. So the achievement gap is defined as, it refers to any significant and persistent disparity in academic performance or educational attainment between different groups of students, such as white students and BIPOC students, for example, or students from a higher income class compared to a lower income household. And Minnesota consistently ranks among the highest performing states when it comes to educational quality in the US. At the same time though, Minnesota is known for having one of the worst achievement gaps, or the biggest achievement gap between white and BIPOC students and high income and low income students. So first, I just want to give a general overview of the state of Minnesota as it comes to the achievement gap. So here are results from 2 test scores. The MCA stands for the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment. These are standardized tests that are given once a year, and I just included results from reading and math. And as you can see here, there is a pretty big gap between the races, and it is important to look at that just so we can understand that this is not a problem just in Golden Valley or just in Minneapolis, but this is a problem with the state overall. Okay, now we're going to look specifically at Golden Valley and the Twin Cities. So like Marin was saying earlier, zip code can be a determinant for a lot of things. One of them is also education, because obviously you can only send your kids to school typically where you live unless you open enroll, but that isn't accessible for everybody. So even though racial covenants are not enforced today, the ramifications continue to perpetuate, which has allowed for segregation in schools to still exist, especially in the Twin Cities and the surrounding suburbs. So this is a map of Golden Valley and their respective school districts. As you guys probably already know, students or children in Golden Valley either go to Robbinsdale or Hopkins for school, depending on where they live. And as you can see too, Golden Valley borders both St. Louis Park in this map and Minneapolis #1. That stands for Minneapolis Zone 1. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about this zone 1 compared to Golden Valley, just because these districts are neighboring districts, but their outcomes are really different. The funding is really different, like Sam was saying, because of property taxes. The schools in Minneapolis Zone 1 do not get as much funding. Additionally, this was an area that historically had a ton of racial covenants. Golden Valley did, but this is part of Minneapolis, did not have any racial covenants. It was actually intentionally and purposefully redlined, which pushed BIPOC families into this area. So I'm just going to compare what it's like now in these two areas. So this is a map of Zone 1 in Minneapolis, and this is kind of a continuation of the map in the previous slide, but it just zooms in on Minneapolis Zone 1. So like I was saying, this area of North Minneapolis did not have racial covenants. It was intentionally redlined. And I'm gonna specifically be looking at Edison High School. I think it's one of the only high schools in North Minneapolis. And I'm gonna be comparing it to the high schools in Golden Valley. And if anybody is curious, I'm gonna send a link in the chat. This is a link to just to Mapping Prejudice if you wanna look at where the racial covenants were. We've talked about it a lot so far in this presentation, so if anyone's curious. Okay. Okay, so this slide, we are seeing the racial demographics between Hopkins in the state level and also Robbinsdale in the state level. And this is just to show that the demographics in these two schools, the schools in Golden Valley, somewhat line up with Minnesota overall. They're pretty accurate, I would say, to that of Minnesota. And on the next slide, this is the demographics for Edison. It's just really important to realize that these districts are neighboring districts, but their demographics are extremely different. And part of this is due to racial covenants and how their impact that they've had over the years, because people of color and BIPOC families were barred from entering suburban communities. And so, especially when they're purposely redlined into North Minneapolis, schools are segregated, and it still happens today, despite whatever the law may say. It's still an issue in a lot of cities, and Minneapolis is not immune to that. Along with standardized test scores, graduation rates is another way to gauge the opportunity or achievement gap. So in this slide, I have all of the graduation rates for Hopkins, Robbinsdale, and Edison. As you can see, Robbinsdale and Hopkins are both above average for Minnesota, and Edison is significantly lower. Just to show again that these are neighborhoods that are right by each other and districts that are right by each other, and the only thing separating them is the districts.
Hi, I'm Ethan, and I'll be talking about the history and issues with policing and how it relates to racial segregation in housing. Go to the next slide. So as we all know, following the murder of George Floyd in May, the issues of police brutality and the system of policing have been at the forefront of political debate. Understanding the racist history of policing is a very important step in making positive change and protecting BIPOC communities who have always been disproportionately affected by policing. First of all, policing is rooted in slavery. The first police forces in America were known as slave patrols. They're created in the early 1700s to control enslaved African Americans. These slave patrols would chase down runaway slaves and return them to their owners. The patrols were also designed to establish organized terror on plantations to deter slave revolts. The first municipal police departments in the North were created during the 1830s. As cities grew, they realized they would need a centralized body to control mob violence, which was particularly directed at immigrants and African Americans by white youth. Go to the next slide. So between the 1800s and early 1900s, following the aftermath of the Civil War, many Black people fled to northern cities to escape the KKK and continued violence in the South. And even though they thought they were fleeing prejudice and racism in the South, contempt and hostility were still directed at Black communities in the North as they moved into predominantly white neighborhoods. White residents sometimes felt threatened by the presence of people of color in their communities, and policing became one method of protecting those white homogeneous communities. So with targeted over-policing to protect white interests, Black and brown skin became equated with criminality, and the system still hasn't changed. So this slide is a striking illustration of how policing still has racial discrimination in its practices. As you can see, there's a clear correlation between the percentage of Black residents in a neighborhood and the likelihood of a white police officer using their gun in instances using force, which again ties back to a lot of the talk we've had about racial segregation in neighborhoods. So as I've said before, BIPOC communities are still disproportionately stopped, monitored, and affected by policing today. First, aggressive tactics like stop and frisk they reinforce associations between Blackness and criminality, and tasking officers to stop people who appear to be suspicious relies on long-standing racial stereotypes. And saturating high crime areas with police conducting stops will inevitably affect innocent residents of poor communities of color. So there's limited policing data from Golden Valley, but we can look at other examples shown on this slide to see vast racial disparities in police practices in cities across the country, and even next door in Minneapolis. For example, one recent study examined the disparities in police stops, searches, and arrests of Native Americans in Minneapolis. And so even though 1.4% of women in Minneapolis reported their race as American Indian or Alaska Native, the police reported that 6.4% of police stops of women involved Native Americans. And after they were stopped, 28% of Native American women were searched, and 20% were arrested, over twice as often as women of any other race. The study noted that the disproportionate stops of Native American women are concentrated in areas with high Native American residents, which follows the findings of other studies of police stops. We know that policing is more concentrated in BIPOC communities. In another study in Minneapolis Police Department, the data showed that African Americans account for about 20% of Minneapolis' population, but they're more likely to be pulled over, arrested, and have force used against them compared to white residents. Black people are also accounted for more than 60% of the victims in Minneapolis police shootings from late 2009 through May 2019. One final study I'm going to mention from the Boston University School of Public Health. Minnesota overall ranked second on their state racism index, just behind Wisconsin. And according to Michael Siegel, one of the study's authors, one variable in their racism index mattered more than the rest. The more racially segregated the neighborhoods in a state, the more striking the ratio of Black to white police shootings of unarmed victims, he said. So as I'm wrapping up here, I just wanted to mention that I grew up in Golden Valley. I have been fortunate to call North Tyrol my neighborhood, my home for the last 20 years. But I do recognize that we have a lot of room to improve when it comes to racial justice, especially my neighborhood, which is still full of racial covenants. So I've never personally been negatively affected by police, but that doesn't mean that it's not an issue, and it does not discount the problems that so many others are facing. So to summarize, the system of policing was founded on slavery, and policing still has racist practices today. It is absolutely crucial for us to recognize and reckon with the broader harm that policing has done to millions of innocent Americans, including those in our own community. And oftentimes those discriminatory practices can be tied back to racial segregation in neighborhoods. So whether we witness it in our own neighborhoods or not, we know through statistics and research and personal accounts that police still target historically segregated neighborhoods. Thank you.
Okay, so that wraps up our presentation. I appreciate you guys all being here. Obviously, we really love to talk because we talked for almost the full hour and we intended to have some time for questions. But if you guys are available, I am sure that we can stick around for a little bit to answer some questions about all the different topics that we talked about in our presentation, because I know it was a lot of information, but we really appreciate that you guys came to this talk tonight.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. My name is Kirsten Santelises. I'm the city's Human Resources Director. I'm also the Human Rights Commission liaison, and we'll say co-liaison to our Equity Task Force. I have the privilege of having some inside information here working with Maria, but I'm very curious how you all got started with this project and why you chose this topic to do this for your project.
Yeah, so we've had some connections with mapping prejudice through St. Olaf. I think if Alyssa Melby is here, she's the one who coordinates those ACE projects for St. Olaf students. So we contacted Mapping Prejudice, and they said, you know, we don't quite have the work that you're looking for right now, but we'll connect you with Maria and Jared, and they were basically like, yeah, absolutely. We would love to work with you. And a lot of us are from Minnesota. And I actually have a racial covenant on my house. And I know Ethan was talking about that as well. So we felt very impassioned about this project and, you know, really wanted to work with Just Deeds.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Your presentation was incredibly informative. I learned some new things tonight that I had not seen before. So thank you all very much. It was really wonderful.
Thank you. I think somebody just raised their hand. Was that? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, how you doing? My name's Shep Harris, and I'm the mayor of Golden Valley, and I just wanted to say thank you very much for this presentation. And even though I'm very aware of what our staff in Golden Valley and what our Human Rights Commission has been doing on racial covenants and trying to discharge them, I still learned a lot more tonight just from the research that you guys done and the presentations. I have to say, from the transportation perspective, I hadn't even thought about it. Even though I've mentioned how North Minneapolis, people who live there, the residents of North Minneapolis, 50% do not own cars. And that was part of the argument that we would make about why we're looking for the Blue Line extension to come through part of the eastern part of Golden Valley. But the way that you guys presented it tonight makes me realize how important it is for us to push for bus rapid transit to go through the central part of our community, because along Highway 55, if we really want to make our community more racially diverse, you guys just basically gave the primary example about why mass transit is so important. Without mass transit, we're going to struggle going forward. So thank you. I just wanted to say thank you very much on behalf of our community and our city council for what you guys are doing.
Thank you so much for coming. It's really an honor to have you here. Yeah, and I think that was really what we were trying to highlight, is that there is room to grow in all of these different areas and address these issues in different ways. And I think with transportation, I really saw, like, in your comprehensive plan that you had really thought about it, but it's just, there's so many aspects to consider, and there is room to grow in the future and how we invest in these things. Yeah, thank you so much.
Hi, this is Joelle Allen. I'm chair of the Racial Equity Task Force. First of all, fantastic job. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. This is really important information. What I would love to hear from at least a couple of you is, what is the most interesting and or alarming piece of information that you uncovered during your research for you?
I know I've been doing a lot of talking. I don't know if someone else in the group wants to jump in.
I can go, yeah. So for me, I think what stuck out to me the most was the intersectionality of restrictive covenants and the harm that really extends from each of our topics were somehow related, like environmental justice and access to parks and transportation and getting to a grocery store to feed your family healthy and affordable and nutritious foods. And ultimately the fact that it boils down to a racist act that happened so far past in the history, but still is having such drastic impacts on the world today, was really alarming for me, at least.
I think I think for just me, a lot of the information that my other like my colleagues put out about, I mean, just your zip code being the best determinant of your, your life expectancy, down to, you hear, at least I've heard, you hear life expectancy from country to country or even like region, but the fact that it could be something that gets down to, neighborhood by neighborhood or sometimes block by block, I think is very alarming, because it shows how, key those environmental factors, and how, because it was put in this one area, it only heavily affects this one area and doesn't affect any other parts of say a city or something. I just was just very, very shocking to me, I think.
I think I would echo exactly what Imani and Miles both said in terms of just the research that we uncovered. But even personally to me, just growing up in Golden Valley, seeing that my town has such a dark history with a racist past that is still affecting the community today, that I had not really learned about growing up. It was definitely shocking for me to learn about, but I'm very glad that I became informed, and that I'm working with a group now to try to hopefully make some change.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I just wanted to jump on here and thank you all.
Yes. My name is Lyndon Smith.
Go ahead.
I'm chair of the MAR Diversity Committee, and I commend all you guys for what you've done. That was a fantastic presentation. But a question that I would like to ask and kind of put to all of you is, now that you have this information and you see the horrific things that has happened a long time ago, but people still don't think that is in effect today. Now that you see that, is that something that you would like to take and carry on and educate your people of your age and others?
I can speak on this because I covered environmental racism during our presentation, and I'm also double majoring in environmental studies. And there's sort of been a conversation amongst some environmental studies majors at St. Olaf College that we don't talk enough about environmental justice, that you take a lot of classes in ecology and you take a class in economics. I apologize if you can hear my roommate tutoring in physics in the background, but we take a lot of classes that are very scientific, and I feel like we learn a lot about environmental studies, but we really do need to have some sort of rigorous course and education in specifically environmental racism, because there's no way that you can remove climate change and the effects of it from how it's going to disproportionately affect people of color. So I totally agree that there is a really intense need to even teach our peers. It's not just teaching other people. We need to look inward as well.
Yeah, and I think this is also a great question for a lot of us. Most of us are graduating within the next year, and I think a lot of us are really going to take what we've learned from this project and from this class into what we want to do in the future. I know, the events of this summer and, learning the history of Minnesota and the systemic racism that really persists has made me want to go in to changing these things with nonprofit work and potentially government work. So I think it really has impacted how I look at my own future and what I can do.
Yeah, I just want to echo, everyone's been saying great things. But yeah, I grew up in St. Louis Park, which is just neighbors, Golden Valley, and my parents actually just moved to Golden Valley in August. I will be back there during my break, but I haven't spent much time there now. And I think it has allowed me to have this conversation with my family and also my friends that I grew up with, because Racial Covenants were also in St. Louis Park. And I think it also speaks to the message that Just Deeds wants to continue to, is with education is one of their core values, and their mission is removing these covenants allows for conversations within families and neighborhoods of the significance of the racial covenants and like why they were there and how that has had an impact. So I'm really happy to be working with Just Deeds in a group that is committed to providing this information and bringing up this conversation that is kind of tough, but it's really important. And yeah, thank you all for attending.
So I just wanted to hop on here and just say to the group, thank you so much for your presentation. It was absolutely wonderful. And I learned a lot. And, you know, I saw a preview of it on Monday and you guys even improved it since then. It was so good and so comprehensive. And I think everyone learned a lot. And you might get some calls from some people asking you to do it again. But I do want to say too that there are some people on this call tonight who are fellow members of the Just Deeds Coalition. We have Jamar Hardy and Lyndon Smith and Kath Hammersing. I think that might be it. But so Lyndon just asked you that last question, and so he's part of the Just Deeds Coalition, and so we're happy to have everyone together here working to educate ourselves and improve things.
Yeah, and I'm able to share this presentation, email it, but I think also we will be putting this recording on the website so you can refer back to it as well. But just put your email in the chat if you'd like me to send it to you directly.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming. We need like some music to play us out.
Thank you.
Would you like to sing, Maria?
I was going to say, Maria, you're a singer. You can sing us out.
Come on. Yep. Melissa, it's the second time in a month you've thrown me under the bus. Come on.
We just need to do a duet is all.
Okay, okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
I think I got all the emails that people were putting in chat.
I was just trying to take a picture of them.
There was some earlier in the
Okay. Well,
questions. I believe I got all of them. Yeah.
Okay, that would be great.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, nice job, guys.
Yeah, good job, guys.
Yeah, I guess there's not really much to say. I will figure out how to send the recording. Probably I'm going to eat after this, so probably not till a little bit later.
Yeah, take some time.
Yeah. Okay. See you guys in class tomorrow.
Bye.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Good job.
Good job, everybody.